Dear friends and comrades, this is another fantastic interview of Wbrew Cenzurze, Without Censorship, Polish independent internet channel. Today, we'd like to reach really global perspective with much appreciated help of our friend, Dr. Paseka Pharumele from University of Johannesburg and South African University, environmental anthropologist and political analyst. Dr. Pharumele, I'm really glad to have you today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, brother. I'm looking forward to having this engagement. It's been a long time coming. So yeah, I'm really excited to engage with you.
And we can start with very small Polish motif in the African-European relations. Just a couple of days ago, it has been jubilee, some kind of African-European relations related to Pan-African and European summit in Luanda. But for the especially Polish viewers, but also for the Western Europeans one, this summit started with some meme. We could see Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk starting his official visit in Luanda and being welcomed with the official diplomatic protocol, with the honored guard, with the Angolan diplomats. And he just left the plane being worn on T-shirt and really, I would say, casual style of clothing. Very unofficial one. And that's illustrate that even peripheral European countries, as present Poland is, still treat summits and meetings with African leaders as some kind of, something between tourism and being really paternalist toward Africa. Do you think that anything changed in relations between Europe and Africa? Or do you think that it's still some kind of this paternalism and protectionism from the European leaders toward Africa?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Now, I think it is essential to always look at the body language of these leaders when they interact. I will give a specific example before we move to Luanda, the Polish president, and how he behaved himself and other European leaders behaved themselves. I need to go back a bit further back when Donald Trump met with 3 African presidents, and in his interaction with them, he was speaking to them as though they were children. And that is very key because when we look at the colonial studies, we are able to recognize that a lot of the West still until this day look at Africans as children. They look at them as young. They look at them as those who need guidance. They look at them as those who need to be taught how to navigate. And it's very problematic because this is why we now find ourselves in a position where specifically Donald Trump can be able to speak to African leaders, not know their names, not know which countries they come from, not believe that they can communicate sufficiently using English. And that is the kind of thing that you see when you look at the recent summit in Luanda and how European presidents were interacting with African presidents. And to an extent, I always make the argument that I do, to an extent, hold African leadership responsible for this. I do understand it has to do a lot with historical racism that comes from Europe looking down on African leaders, but I also do hold African leaders accountable for this. Specifically, the reason why I hold African leaders accountable for this is because they do not present themselves as competent leaders. There's too much corruption that happens in the country, in the continent, even though we know that the corruption that happens in the continent is also enabled by Europe and the rest of the West. But at the end of the day, African leaders do not necessarily present themselves as the brightest of leaders. They do not present themselves as the most confident of leaders. I can say I have a problem with the South African president Ramaphosa, but the way he represents himself is somewhat slightly more different from how other leaders represent themselves to the rest of the world. So, going back to the question that you asked, I think I will hold African leaders accountable for them themselves not taking themselves serious enough, not taking each other serious enough, so that they could be able to portray a stronger united front when engaging with other continents, specifically Europe in this specific context. And with that being said, we now get to the main point is that I do not think things have changed. I do not believe that things have changed. I do believe that it is still the same. I think that if anything, it has gotten worse because the relationship between Africa and Europe and the rest of the world is still one which is centered around Africa being children, those who need guidance, those who need to humble themselves in front of the rest of the world. So that is very key, I think, and it's a good starting point.
Yeah, well, when we, for example, read the commentaries about Luanda summits, a lot of European comments was about that was some kind of second-class summit when we compare that, for example, to the peace negotiation between United States and Russia about Ukrainian war.
Mm,
So even knowing importance of Africa, especially, for example, for the energy transition of Europe, they still believe that relations with the one of the most important in perspective of the world development continents is second class
mm,
relations.
mm.
And so they come to land only because they had to. They have been not invited to negotiation with big boys. And then finally they find the time to discuss about some kind of relations with Africa. And again, in the context of competition with Russia and with China. So main commentaries in Europe was about how to prevent further Chinese-African relations development. And it was something which was, well, the core of, for example, Luanda's speech of Chancellor Merz. So do you believe that for the former colonial powers, or do they still see Africa as just a place of competition between the powers?
Oh, that is very important. That is very important because what it takes us back to is you look at the previous engagements that we've seen. I think the most recent one would have been the engagement between Ibrahim Traore, the president of sorry, what's this? There in the Sahel. I'm sorry, I forgot the Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso. You look at how his recent travels to Russia, how he was interacting with Vladimir Putin, how Putin treated him. And then you look at how other leaders of the continent are being treated by other European leaders. And that is very important. That is very important. How China interacts with African leaders, how the president, how she interacts with African leaders, how Putin interacts with African leaders. That's not the same as how the rest of the West interacts with African leaders. And that is very important. And I think the discourse that we are currently witnessing, where people are saying Africa is finding itself in the middle of a fight between the East and the West, that discourse, it neglects to note that the reason why Africa shifted its allegiance to the East, specifically China and Russia, is because the West had been taking advantage of Africa for a very long time. You know, it's historically factual that the West had been taking consistent advantage of Africa and these are several of these African countries, taking out minerals with next to nothing in return, deciding who can be president, you know, having policy changes from the West, you know, for African countries. And that's one of the main reasons, if not two of the main reasons, why the continent has found itself stagnant. But because of that relationship, a lot of African leaders have decided to find alternative partnerships. So now, what that has resulted in, it has resulted in us finding ourselves in the middle of the battle between the West and the East. But the key thing for me as an African, you know, the key thing for me as an African is that we shouldn't be the battleground for these two giants. We should actually be moving away from being dependent on other world leaders because Africa, we know, is wealthy enough in terms of its minerals, in terms of, to an extent, some access to oil. It's wealthy enough to be able to self-sustain. But because of the role that the West consistently continues to play in the continent, it becomes very difficult. How Europe continues to extract, be able to function. I mean, France, we all know, historically, even its previous president emphasized that France would have collapsed as a military and economic leader in the world if it was not for Africa. So if that is the case, it means that there is enough resources for us to upgrade the continent. But through Western imperialism and corruption, African corruption, we find ourselves in the same place. So that question that you ask about where if we could look at this as Africa being used as a pawn, in this fight between the West and the East, it's a very important one. But the reality is that the West is responsible for where Africa has decided to position itself in current discourse and who it has decided to align itself with. A lot of the Sahel countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and etc. The reason why they decided that they were going to move away from France is because France, for so many years, has been there, yet still there were terrorist attacks that were consistent. At this point, it was rational to make the argument that France is destabilizing the area. So what did they do? They decided there were several coups that took place. After those coups took place, the new leadership that came in decided to shift allegiance from France, and it pushed France out of the Sahel. And this is why we see now, in actual fact, the area of the Sahel has become more stable, and now we now have to start asking a lot of questions. So if anything, what that case study specifically shows us is that there's a lot of interruptions that happen in the continent that stagnate the continent, and that stop development in the continent, and that is done intentionally by a lot of these European powers. So that is very key. So that is why I'm making the argument that Africa will continuously, more and more African countries will continuously move towards the East. And I'm not saying that it's better in the East, but we progressively learn as we go. There is historical knowledge and evidence of the West taking advantage of the continent. But Africa needs to stand on the table as adults, not as children who need to be guided, who need to be taught, who need to, protected. So that is very key. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe that we can also observe that one of the very useful and traditional tools for the neocolonial powers is provoking instability in Africa. That's a very typical way of how this continent is treated. When we first had these very aggressive remarks of Donald Trump's about Nigeria, who, let's remind me, several years ago has been just left, despite of any trade and investment agreement between USA and Nigeria. Nigeria was left with absolutely nothing in hands after a lot of promises, American promises about development of oil sector in Nigeria. After shale boom in America, they have just left everything.
Yep.
And when this emptiness has been fulfilled by mainly Chinese investors, or also internal Nigerian ones, it has been now accused of a treason almost by Donald Trump. We have another example. It was mentioned by Merz that Europe is particularly interested in these energy investment initiatives like the Lobito corridor in Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia, and is really keen of securing own control on this strategic area of transport of rare earth elements and other mineral resources to Europe. They are provoking war in conflict between Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo. We know that European weapon is still exported to Emirates and then re-exported to South Sudan as a part of internal conflict in this state. So they still use the same methods they used to use in 60s and in 70s to supporting instability and internal wars. It doesn't show that they not only treat seriously African leaders and African states, but still they see Africa in general as only pack of resources and a field of wars, even the very active wars.
Now Yeah, continue, please continue. Sorry.
No, no, and my question is, how, in your opinion, how Africa could respond to this attitude of colonial powers as well, European as America? Do you think that, well, some kind of cooperation as still now, so African Union or African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's the way of responding of Africans' response to neocolonial powers, or it's also could be or is influenced or even corrupted by neocolonial powers? What do you think? Because it's a very thick, sensitive moment for Africa.
It is. And I think Africa's biggest problem is that Africa is not able to present itself as a united front. And that alone is a big problem for the continent. I will start with how Donald Trump has been speaking about Nigeria. And we know the only reason that the United States is interested in Nigeria is because Nigeria has oil reserves. Nigeria has huge oil reserves, which they have not fully taken advantage of because those reserves should be helping them stabilize themselves. We do know that Nigeria has a consistent problem of terrorism, especially in the north of Nigeria. But the terrorists do not necessarily kill based on religion, because what the West has done, which is their old school tactic, is to say Christians have been attacked. But in reality, those terrorists, they might be extremist Muslims, but those terrorists attack everyone. So they want to practice Sharia law. So conservative, mild, actually mid Muslims, what they see them as they call them kafir, which is non-believer. So that is so. What how Donald Trump portrays this, how he speaks about it, it's as if Muslims are taking Christians, and that is factually incorrect. But because he needs to push a specific narrative. What has the rest of the continent done? What has the leadership of Nigeria done? They've not done anything. They've not spoken to it. After that, what happened was that he's been for in recent years, Trump has been speaking about South Africa. Even before his last presidency term ended, just when it was about to end, he started speaking about South Africa. What did he say? South African blacks are taking South African white people. But he says there's an ongoing genocide that is happening in South Africa. Every bit of evidence that has been provided to him to show this is an incorrect narrative, UN reports, Genocide Watch reports, the South African police reports, statistics, and whatnot. Everything that has been given to him shows that in actual fact, the most privileged people in the country continue to be the Afrikaners, continue to be white South Africans, but he doesn't want to believe that. Why? He needs to push a certain narrative. But we know that it boils down to several things. The people is surrounded by Peter Thiel, your Elon Musk, and also South Africa going ahead and contesting the Israel's current genocide in Palestine. So we know that is technically what all this is about. But because he's able to drive a narrative, those who believe in him, they're able to support this without any evidence, with just having his foot soldiers on the ground, picking up where they can, coming out and saying this is the narrative. The facts don't matter. This is why we say we live in an age of disinformation and misinformation, where it's very difficult to tell what is factual, what is not. So those tactics, unfortunately for Trump, Europe is not aligning with him. That's where the problem is, right? Because the reason why the United States was able to invade Iraq, sorry. The reason why they were able to topple so many governments the world over, the reason why they were able to go to Libya through NATO is because they were in agreement. There was a commonality. They had the same logic. But now, what has happened as of late? Because Trump has also gone and he has attacked his own allies, it becomes very difficult for them to agree that we are going to produce a specific narrative, where if he says in Nigeria Christians are being attacked, the UK would agree. Stemmer would say yes, Christian Nigerians are being attacked. If he says in South Africa there's a genocide, Macron would say yes, there's a genocide. South Africa just over the past weekend was hosting the G20. the leaderships of the UK or France, the United States historical allies were here. Historically, if they were in agreement, they were going to not come to the country, which then gives you the foundation to be able to attack a country. So if that is the case now, it means that the old tricks and he is trying to use them, but they're not easy to implement because he does not necessarily have allies who are going to enable the United States to do as it pleases, as it has historically done. Because if you push a narrative, then you are able to produce mass disinformation through the news media, through the BBC, as we saw. What's this Israel trying to do through the New York Times? There's these huge stories that we saw historically would be produced in mass so that the narrative would be shifted away from what is actually happening in the ground. So that would give you a foundation and a pre-reason for you to be able to action invading a country and attacking a country. And we see it in Venezuela as well. If it was historically, Venezuela would be attacked already. Maduro would have been attacked right now, and we don't know whether he would have lived or he would have survived. But now, because it's not so easy to shift narrative, there's platforms such as this one where we can have these discussions where it can go out there, people can listen, and it could be a discussion. But before this, there was only one source of information, and which was the news media. It was your BBCs and other, other platforms where it would be newspapers and whatnot. So because of that, that narrative, it's difficult to push. The same antics that have been used initially, as you were speaking to the case of Nigeria, and I introduced the case of South Africa, those narratives could have been pushed because it was easier at the time to be able to push misinformation, to push a discourse, and to push whatever you hold of value at the time. But now it has become a bit more difficult and a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I believe that you mentioned a very important element because discourse in general and the language used is one of the strongest weapon now, and it's very obvious, I believe. And here we can see these differences because well, that's America now under Donald Trump leadership. It takes this element of the old-fashioned domination language over Africa. That was the presenting, for example, South American affairs as a just pure chaos and genocide and a permanent conflict. So it was like language of African extremists. In fact, it was just repeating this accusation from I don't know 30 years ago, and in the same time, but we have a bit different European narrative, still very keen on cultural neocolonialism, I would say. So they know that in fact they are dependent on Africa in many elements. So when we think, I don't know, about French nuclear program, it's based mainly on African resources. When we think about any kind of European energy transition, especially when it's done in competition with China. So again, Europe should look on Africa as for the partners. That's the main point. But they still try to patronize African countries. So they discuss, okay, but if you want to trade with us, you have to accept a whole Western European cultural platform. So you have to take all transgender agenda. You have to agree for big energy transformation too. So just transform Africa and main very large territories in Africa in the solar panels farms and something like that. They want to again reshape Africa to be more like well, like a European cultural colony. So that's I think that's I'm very wondering your opinion, because I think that's the main difference when we observe any kind of relations between Africa and America and Europe, and in the same time when we observe how what's the attitude toward Africa from Moscow and Beijing. So that's completely different in Russia, from Russia and from China. And I totally agree that's of course it's not the point to just replace European post-colonial domination with some kinds of unequal relations with China and Russia, but it's some kind of choice for Africa. Do you think that African leaders, especially politicians, but also well, cultural environment in Africa, is willing to accept this cultural domination of Western Europe? So accept all these typical for Western neoliberal agenda elements like transgender, climate, energy transition, and other elements like that. Do you think that it's a moment for Africa, or you are strong enough to resist?
I think it's dependent, right? Because culturally, Africa might be able to resist because I think that Africa is still a relatively conservative continent and they still value their cultures. But when we now speak of financially, that is where the problem is because a lot of these proposals are presented. I look at in training, I'm a geographer in training. My PhD is geography. So in training, not in training, sorry. So things such as the just transition that Germany has been pushing significantly as of late is something that is a bit worrying for me because as much as they are transitioning or trying to transition South Africa and the rest of the continent, yet still the European Union still continues to buy coal from Africa. Now, we now have to ask a lot of questions because if we are saying that South Africa is supposed to switch to a more sustainable or environmentalist sustainable form of energy, but Europe still buys coal in chunks from South Africa, then there's a level of hypocrisy that we are not speaking about. What is the science behind that? We now have to have an academic discussion and discourse around that. But going back to these narratives, European neoliberal ideologies and ideas that Europe continues to push, we need to understand the only way for them to be able to successfully drive them throughout the continent is to be able to finance a lot of the countries in the continent. So that is the main thing that African leaders, look forward to. You look at the Luanda summit that just happened. In the summit itself, the primary discussion and discourse was around funding. And as always, the biggest struggle and the most frustrating thing for me is that the continent is still overly reliant on being funded instead of self-funding. That discussion is around being funded, where I believe that the continent has the capability and enough resources to be able to fund itself. But going back to the point, if European countries are able to finance these ideas and push this funding into the continent, but we know they come as a form of loans. But I don't think that our leadership is strategic and smart enough to know that eventually this money needs to go back in some way or another, in one way or another, it needs to go back to Europe. I'm not sure if a lot of them do understand that rationale. But once that is done, the ideas are driven in. Now they are forced to push specific narratives, specifically these agendas, these neoliberal agendas that you were speaking to right now. So I think that in terms of cultural change, it is something that Africa and a lot of these of our African countries hold dearly, and they try to resist. But once there comes the notion or the element of funding, then the discourse changes, the narrative changes, because also leadership does not hold its own ground, especially when it is heavily funded.
Yeah, and well, when we speak about founding and about finance relations, we of course have on back of our heads memories how so-called Western aid was organized as a system of organized corruption and political and cultural domination over African people, and of course it was presented as a kind of humanitarian gift only. So it was what was absolutely nuisance. And for everyone who knows the history of this segment of relation between West and Africa, and another sensitive, I think, element in relations between Africa and Europe is, of course, question of migration. Yeah, and we can observe that in the same time. For example, the British government, in fact, transformed all the streams of migration to the United Kingdom. They effectively blocked migration from Eastern Europe from the former communist countries, but well, wider open the doors for limited migration from some, especially former colonies in Africa. Of course, they try to cover that as a kind of transfer of skills. A lot of African migrants came to the UK as students, even if they are already graduated in the old countries, just to work on the well, down of the ladder in the United Kingdom to be allowed to work on it on 20 hours only. So they just well they just exploit the intellects of African people coming to Europe to just to do very basic and works which should be well not demanding any skills from that. So it's the degrading so it's a kind of the classification of these migrants. And in the same time, the same British government, previous and actual one, try to see Africa as a place to send back unwanted migrants. Also, this so-called Rwanda Protocol introduced by the former government and still, in fact, being in progress by the present Labour government, it's that they see, Africa as just a bottomless bucket to take migrants if they wanted to do some kind of very basic jobs, and to send back when they stopped to be useful for the British Empire, former British Empire. It's no change, but in the same time, it's something which is very sensitive for attitude of European people. Migration is seen by the European people as kind of problem. And they do not understand the reasons of so great, big human movements to the north, but still see the results. So and they can see that this neoliberal incompetence of the Western governments is covered by well, migration being only the result of this incompetence and this attitude toward Africa. What do you think could or should be Pan-African, in fact, answer for the migration part of relations with Africa? In Europe.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, it's one of the things that I speak about in my PhD is specifically immigration, right? One of the points that's never discussed when we speak about south-north migration is that the majority of migration that happens is south-south migration. Africans who move from the south trying to get access to the north, the number is significantly lower as compared to those who actually migrate within the south, specifically within the continent of Africa. So what that tells you is that Africans do not have the desire to move to Europe, but the people who migrate and who move, what they attempt to do is to move to areas that are safer than where they come from. Most people do not necessarily want to move from their homes to go to, a lot of us, if it was up to me, I would never leave my country. I'm very happy at home. But if a civil war was to happen, there's consistent terrorist attacks that are happening, there's consistent instability that is happening, there's economic stress that is happening. Chances are I'm going to be uncomfortable enough, I'm going to be stretched out enough to be able to decide that I'm going to move. And now, the environment in which you move to, it might not be the perfect environment. In actual fact, it might be horrible. But because of how bad it is back home, you just decided that you're going to move. So that is the first key thing that we always need to keep in mind when discussing migration. Now, here's the second thing that matters. The reason why a lot of, like you go to France, there's a lot of people who come from Senegal, who comes from the Sahel, who comes from, like a lot of the Francophone countries, the former colonies. And you go to Europe, it's a lot of people, the people who are there will be people from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, a lot of these Anglophone countries. Why that is the case? The continent has been so stressed out over the last few years or the last few decades that people are going to go to a country that has been sold to them as the ideal country to move to. And that is very important. People who have to move, who are being forced to leave home because the environment is not sustainable and it's not functional for you to be able to succeed in. You go where all your resources are being kept. The current I'm sorry, I'm not sure if she's the president or she's the prime minister of Italy. I think it's Malone. That woman, when she was sold to us, before I even paid attention to her, she was sold to us as a racist who is a right wing individual who doesn't want anything to do with everyone. She was sold as this terrible person. But I listened to her speak, and this is what is very important. It is easy for the media to sell you a narrative about people, but when you listen to people speak, that woman said something that is important. She said, the reason why Europe is suffering with these levels of immigration is because of Europe itself. It's because of France. It's because of the UK. It's because of these countries that continue until this day to benefit from the continent of Africa, that continue to destabilize, that continues to fund these attacks that we cannot make sense of, and train these terrorist groups that continue to attack people in the more northern part of the continent. You look at the case of Mozambique right now, right? Mozambique has a lot of oil reserves. However, Mozambique is not able to extract legally its oil sufficiently and build enough companies to be able to have a functional economy that would be around its oil and gas. Why is that the case? It's because the area has become so destabilized that you can only be able to trade illegally. Who benefits when oil and gas is being traded illegally? It can only be those countries who buy the resources. So, and a lot of the time it's in Europe. The instability that we see in the Sudan, which you basically spoke to earlier on. You go to the Congo. Who benefits for the cobalt that is being extracted from the Congo? It is Europe. It is the Americas. It's America specifically. So that is very, very important. And when we now speak about instability and we speak to migration, when we now look at what is happening in Europe, and a lot of people are uncomfortable, we see this constantly. I mean, in the UK, there were big protests, by the English, saying England our home and whatnot. And it's easy for me to make an analysis and say, oh, it's just racists who want to remove Africans from their country. But when you listen to what people speak about, and that is very key. You need to be able to listen for you to be able to understand why people have the problems that they have and why people have their protests. There will be problematic people who do these things based off racism, but the majority of the people are coming from a good place. They genuinely feel like our environment has been overrun. We are not benefiting from our government. We are not being given housing. It's actually an argument that happens also consistently in South Africa. South Africa is a relatively comfortable country. We are a relatively decent country, especially if you are more in the middle class, because we still have high rates of unemployment and to an extent poverty. But overall, everything works. It feels good to be in this country. But there is similar problems and people who complain, and we call them xenophobic and whatnot, about why is it more relaxing to be an illegal foreigner in the country but than to be a South African? They argue that there's these non-funded organizations that will protect illegal immigrants as opposed to protecting South Africans in South Africa. They will argue that they are not able to get access to housing, but illegal immigrants are able to hijack buildings and whatnot. And those are similar discussions that I see happening in Europe, where people are saying we are not able to access housing, we are homeless. However, you are able to book hotels for foreigners. So it's essential for us to also challenge the problematic discourses, but to also understand, which is very key, or to listen with understanding and not be. It's easy to judge before understanding because you hold your own positionality in whatever discourse you get involved in. But once you are able to hear and understand where people come from, I think that you are more likely to hear that most people want good for themselves. And that is very important and that is very key. Thank you.
And I think that's the perfect conclusion because, yeah, that's absolutely, I can absolutely agree that we see that as previously, especially Europe, used to shift own problems to Africa. We can observe that on fields, for example, of energy, when the sustainability and environment and climate friendly politics of European governments is done at the cost of environmental destruction in Africa, for example. We can see that how they shape their own discourses again in the cost of the African people and also migrants from Africa coming to the Western countries. Yeah, we can still see that this unequal treatment and not listening, not listening, the to the partners is one of the main problems of between not only Europe but in general West and Africa. And I think that's discussions as ours, and I hope we'll meet again soon to discuss more detailed problems of our relations. Is very important because we do some kind of citizen diplomacy, in fact, about it. I was really grateful for this conversation. Dear friends and comrades, this was another fantastic interview of Wbrew Cenzurze, Without Censorship, independent Polish internet channel. And our noble guests were Dr. Paseka Pharumele from University of Johannesburg and South African University. I'm really, really glad that you have time to join us. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this engagement, and I am looking forward to having another one where we can dissect these matters even deeper. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, and see you soon. Thank you.